Okay, Dr. Carlson, you can turn on your video. Okay, we start now. Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon to all participants in YouTube. First of all, thank you very much for attending, register, and participating in the online training on qualitative data analysis, examples from NVivo software. This course is organized by Center for Southeast Asian Studies and Norwegian Institute for Water Research, or NIVA, as part of the ASEAN-Norwegian Cooperation Project on local capacity building for reducing plastic pollution in the ASEAN region, or ASEANO. My name is Ratna. I'm from the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and I will be the moderator for today's event. Now, I would like to introduce to you all our trainer for this course. She is Dr. Marianne Carlson. Hello, Dr. Marianne Carlson. Good morning.
Hello.
I
Good
believe,
morning.
yeah, I believe in Oslo now still 9 a.m. Okay. Dr. Marianne Carlson currently works at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research as a research scientist. She holds a PhD in environmental and developmental studies. She worked on the issue of climate change and adaptation, societies and environment, natural resource, and geography. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Marianne Carlson for start to give the course now. So for Dr. Marianne Carlson, over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Ratna. I will just share my screen. Is it displaying correctly now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, yeah, so thank you very much for joining this course. As Ratna mentioned, my name is Marianne Carlson and I work at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research. And this online training course is part of the collaboration that Ratna mentioned and the ASEANO project that seeks to reduce plastic pollution in the ASEAN region with case studies in Indonesia and the Philippines. And just a bit about myself, I have been working on environmental issues from a social science perspective for about 10 years now. I'm not, I'm not an expert in methodology. I'm not a trainer in NVivo, but this is perhaps a more practical approach to how I have approached issues relating to qualitative data collection and analysis. So I think this is, I hope this will be useful for you, and this might be approached as an overview. And if you're interested in particular elements and so forth, we may come back to this in courses that we can have later on. So thank you for joining. And just for today's outline, I will just, since I don't have a very detailed overview of who you are, so for some of you, this might be very basic, and for others, it might be more complex. It depends upon your previous knowledge. I'm just going to give a basic overview of qualitative research, what it is, qualitative data, how it can be collected, and then move on a bit more into qualitative interviews that I have worked most with in terms of data collection. And then we will move over to how you analyze qualitative data and in particular interviews, and then how you can use the program NVivo for organizing a project and to analyze your data. So this is basically the overview for today. And I very much encourage you to, if you have questions or comments and so forth, to forward them to the host. And I hope we can have a fruitful discussion towards the end of the presentation. So just as a basic overview, I'm sure most of you are already aware of this, but the main differences between quantitative and qualitative research is that qualitative research, in contrast to quantitative research, focus on what you can observe, but you cannot quantify, you cannot put it into numbers. And while quantitative research often look for what, where, when, who, qualitative research are concerned with why something happens and how it happens. And this also has implications for when you want to analyze the data. In quantitative research, you often use a statistical analysis, whereas in the qualitative sciences, it's interpretive, so it depends upon your own skills and your own position. And while in the quantitative research, we often look for generalizations, patterns, trends over a broad sample of the population, qualitative research often are more exploratory and look into in-depth details about a much smaller population. So generalization is not an objective as such. And that also goes for the goal of replicability that is often one in quantitative research. Qualitative research is set up in a sense that in order to understand, for example, how someone thinks about a specific topic or views elements of the world, you have to understand the context that that person is in. And it also depends upon you as a person to what kind of results or data you get from a person, what kind of information that person is willing to share with you. So this leads to where quantitative research looks for trends, qualitative research often looks for meaning, and the deeper meaning behind social phenomena of various kinds, also in the environmental sphere. So just to briefly provide examples of how this can be approached in environmental research, using the example of Asiano. For example, it is stated, it's known that Indonesia, for example, generates a lot of plastic waste each year. And for example, it's said that 10 billion plastic bags each year are released into the environment. And there are different policy attempts, for example, to try to mitigate this problem. One was a municipal policy that was implemented in 2016 in some case municipalities that included a levy. And this was found to lead to approximately a 55% reduction in plastic bag use. However, the policy was later drawn back. So what we now need to understand when new policies are developing and how are starting to be implemented, how can they be effective, seen as fair, and also have the desired results. And here it might not be, while quantitative social science can help a lot in determining, for example, what kind of price are consumers willing to pay for a plastic bag, what kind of mechanisms deter them from using plastic and so forth. We also need to know why different segments of societies, for example, industrial sectors, agree or disagree with certain policy initiatives, why they think that they fail, and how consumers relate the use of plastic in their everyday life. Why, for example, it's seen as valuable to use a plastic bag as maybe a service from the retailer, or things like that. Why certain norms influence why people behave in a certain way, and that cannot be grasped through quantitative research, but we need to know more about how these factors play out also in different contexts, because it might be that consumers in one area have different perspectives from the ones in another, and so forth. Industrial sectors might be different from each other, and also within each other, determined on size and operations and so forth. So that's why we also need qualitative data. Another example that I worked on in my PhD is, for example, this sea level rise and coastal erosion that is a problem worldwide. And often when we talk about this, we look at assessments saying, for example, in this quote, that if sea level is rising with 1 meter, 73% of all the major tourist resorts and 50% of the airports are at risk in Belize, where I did my PhD. And this can then be related to how many people are employed at tourism resorts, how many people come in through airports, and what would it cost to replace or rebuild airports and to secure jobs in other sectors. This can all be made by quantifications and service and so forth. But what you cannot grasp is how does it feel to lose a home? How does it feel to lose a beach where you perhaps grew up? And how this process, for example, affect life and prospect for an affected community. And to understand this, you need to understand the community and to understand what they feel about living there and how this environmental change has affected their social lives. So in this case, I found that perhaps the most pressing concern in this village that I studied was that because the land was eroding, they view that the future development prospects for the village had kind of disappeared because, and this was a village that was already suffering from out-migration. So without any future development options, they fear that the village would die basically, or that more and more people would move and the village would no longer function the way that it did today and had done in the past. So this is these examples, I want to show that what you get from qualitative data offers a different and a complementary description of events that are global but also local. So we need often we need both methodologies to understand the processes that we are facing and to us understand what kind of policies and actions we need to take that make sense both at national and a local level. And maybe you have all had a course in philosophy of science. I'm not a philosopher, but there are different positions in how we perceive the role of science and what science should provide and what it cannot provide. And some key concepts that I explain here, very basic. These are all subject to extensive lectures on their own, but I'll just briefly touch upon them because they also influence how some social science and some qualitative research is perceived by others, for example. So ontology, you might have heard of this concept. It's basically what we think the world is. And epistemology is based upon the ontology. How can we then know and study the world? And there are two main positions. There are also some middle ground between those, but you see that in realism and positivism, I'm not sure if you probably come across these concepts at some point. The idea here is that science, the ontology is that there is an objective world that we can capture through science. So science can, by, for example, formulating hypotheses, testing them out, experimenting, eventually establish abstract and universal laws. And this is true for some natural phenomena, for example, gravitation or other rule-bound laws of physics and so forth. And some also argue that in the positivist social sciences, these social sciences should approach social phenomena similar to natural sciences in that they should establish laws and on how people behave based upon a certain stimuli, for example. Some approaches in economy may do this. How do people behave if they're given a certain amount of economic options or so forth? And the other position is constructivism, and this is more rooted in the deep social sciences. And here it's more so that science can only capture how we think about the world, because how we think about the world as human beings is always going to be kind of cloaked in language, the language we know, how we think, how that influence mental models, the way we speak about things are, what technologies we have put into action. And these are all social constructs in a sense. So we cannot get out of this bubble of social constructs. So the only thing we can really study is how people think about the world, not the world in itself. And there's some middle grounds here too, that argue that, for example, we can argue that the world exists, but that it's also conditioned by social processes. So there are mixes into how we see these things. But what can be problematic is if we are doing qualitative research and data collection, and some people might think that this should, as closely as possible, resemble natural sciences, or to establish laws and things like that. And then there might be concerns about objectivity, like we should reduce as much bias as possible when we approach the research problem. And this may actually distract from what most social scientists try to achieve, namely to understand social meaning and how people approach different phenomena in their worlds. Yeah, so this was just briefly on these positions. That might be something that you learn more about in other contexts. And then when we come to what is qualitative data and what are common collection methods, most commonly you can analyze text as qualitative data, text written now or previously. And this can be done through narrative analysis, content analysis, literature reviews, and so forth, where you try to establish different meanings and concepts from this text. It can also be approached through observing practices, for example, through observations of how people behave. And this is often a useful complement, because all the things we do, we don't say, and we might not even be aware of some things that we do. We might not be able to put words on how we act. We may say that we act in a certain way, but it doesn't really apply. And that might not be because we don't want to say what we do, but I think the way that we actually interact with others is may not be so suitable, for example, for an interview. So it's participant observation is a good idea to get a better idea of practices, how people interact and how they act in certain situations and so forth. There's of course also stories and discourses that can be accessed through interviews, also focus group interviews and participatory exercises. And you can also approach qualitative data as images and visual representations. I haven't done this much myself, but there are also methods for how to do that. For example, what does images from different time periods or in different settings, what kind of social codes do they represent? What can we learn from how they're presented and so forth? But all these methods focuses on getting insights, getting the reasoning and motivations to why people act or perceive social phenomena in different way. And often, by using multiple methods, we increase the way that we can see a certain phenomenon. We can also reduce certain weaknesses that is associated with one method. Example, if we use interviews and participant observation in tandem, we will have a richer empirical material, and we can also perhaps give it more strength by comparing what we see to what people say, and if there's any differences and so forth. So I'm not sure if you're in the process of starting up a project or if you're already using different methods, but it would also be interesting to hear more about what kind of qualitative methods you are using or thinking of using. And then we can just move on to some characteristics of qualitative data collection in contrast to more quantitative approaches. To understand how someone thinks about a certain problem, you need to first to get access to them, and then to establish trust and rapport with the ones that you want to study. So here qualitative research often entails a certain level of familiarization, trust building to basically establish some kind of relationship with the person that you wish to ask more about and want to know more about how they think about the world. And it's also relational and dynamic, and that I mean that by depending on the situation, depending upon your relationship or chemistry with the other person, the meaning that the interview, for example, results in will be different. So it's constructed in the interaction between the listener and the speaker, depends on how they perceive you and how you perceive them, and what kind of how well you're able to establish a connection and to engage in a conversation and so forth. And this also in quantitative sciences and especially the natural sciences, subjectivity and bias is often seen as a major problem, that the results should be as objective and free from bias as possible. But in qualitative research, we often see that some kind of bias and subjectivity, we need to come from a certain place. We need to understand certain social phenomena to be able to understand what informants are saying too. So here it might not be seen so much as a problem, but also as a precondition. If we were to get completely objective answers, that would perhaps require us to not know too much about either the problem or the person or the context we want to speak, but then we wouldn't really be able to yield any useful results either. So rather than a problem, it can be a precondition that kind of helps us our understanding into a problem. But of course, as in other research, this also has to be made transparent. For example, if you are conducting data in a village or a neighborhood that you're from and know very well, you will probably gain more access to the neighborhood and know more about the problems that they convey. But perhaps in the method section, you also need to reflect upon your position in the society. What does it mean for the results and so forth? Doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it needs to be reflected upon and made transparent. And it's also context dependent. So it needs to be reported in reference to the context that which it was gathered. Like even words or meanings are kind of generated from a certain social context, and it's difficult to take them out of that context without losing some of the meaning. So this context and meaning needs to be carefully intertwined and to reported on. Moving on to the interview. So if you're doing qualitative interviews, which that's a method that I've been using the most. In a sense, the interview situation is also quite special because it seeks to create a symmetrical situation, a kind of dialogue, conversation between, if it's me as an interviewer, and someone that we can see as an interviewee or an informant. And I, of course, am looking for information, and the other one is providing information. Although this is an ideal situation, would be that this situation is symmetrical and free from different power relations. In all cases, almost they are not. And it depends upon what social role you have, what position you have. And this can vary a lot. Like, for example, when I was doing field work in coastal Belize, you can have, as someone from a different place, a student, interviewing fishers, for example, you have kind of dual roles. You're both a foreigner and you're supposedly someone, because of how we look, that they perceive as richer. So there's multiple different positions that you may come across in an interview position. And also if you're a student interviewing high officials, for example, you might get different results than if it would be a professor that interview that high official. And it can go in both ways. Someone that's high up on the hierarchy might be more feel that a student is less threatening, perhaps, than a professor. Or it may also be that it doesn't want to share too much information because it doesn't see the student as a match to his rank. So it varies, but it's quite interesting to see how this plays out, I think, when you talk to people. And also in the interview situation itself, we as researchers are much more in need of the information than the informants are in need to provide it. So we are, in a sense, in less power there. So maybe you have experience with this and how you dealt with it. It'll be also interesting to hear. So you can choose to think of interviews in two different dimensions. They are based upon structure and formality. A very structured interview is very closely related to a survey, perhaps, where everything is standardized and pre-definitions of both questions and responses. The informant doesn't have many options, or it doesn't have any options to go beyond what's already in the questionnaire. Semi-structured interviews, which I have worked the most with, and many qualitative scientists do, is it's structured somewhat along themes and questions, core questions perhaps that you want to know about and that you want all the informants to answer, but they're open for elaborations and reflections, and they can also be so that for example, if one informant is more knowledgeable or willing to talk about one subject, you may not force them to go through all the questions and so forth. There's also another dimension related to formality, how formal you want the interview situation to be. It can be very formal, where, for example, the interview controls the interview situation, asking the same questions in the same order, and then try to seek replicability of the answers. In another setting, you may be more informal. This may often occur when you know the informant well. Then the interview might not be so, it might be more like a conversation. Within the conversation, you gain certain pieces of information. And this is often open for negotiation and redefinition, so you can have a discussion more freely. But the problem with this may be that it's difficult to kind of filter out the relevant information for your study in all the other information that is provided. And if you have any experience with this and see any particular benefits and challenges with these, we could also discuss perhaps. And there's also different types of interviews. What most common one is, of course, the one-to-one interview. You try to get a more in-depth understanding of a person's experience and views. And by meeting someone one by one, it might be easier to establish trust and rapport and to get the conversation going. And you get exclusive access to that person's view, and it can answer in the kind of pace that it feels is appropriate. And there's also focus group discussions, which are very useful. And this is to create discussion between different views and participants, and to gain collective experience. For example, if you want to recall specific events or how things work, it might be easier for people if it's, say, 4 people to remember how things played out than if just one is present. The risk with this is that perhaps you have 1 or 2 that is very talkative or dominant, and they might dominate the discussion and suppress other views. This is something you'll just have to contend with, and may also be more challenging to document and record. And then you have key informant interviews. which are often defined as people that have very specific and good knowledge about the issues that you want to know about. If you're starting a new project, it might also be someone as might be considered as a gate opener that can open the gate to access a specific community or different topics. And it's often good to, I find, to talk to people like this also in the beginning to get more scoping and overview of the issues at hand. And towards the end, to get, if you have the other interview results ready, you can discuss with this person about if you think that the interpretation that you made has been correct and so forth. So this is just a basic overview of what kind of interviews you have. And ways to structure an interview, as you probably are most aware of, the most common and perhaps easiest way to structure an interview is to use an interview guide. And this ensures that specific themes, topics, questions are covered and that they also correspond to the objectives that you set out in your project or thesis. I also find it as a very useful aid to yourself, especially if you're starting out research and you're new to a topic and so forth. It might not be easy to keep track of the topics that you have talked about, and by having an interview guide at hand, it might make it easier to ensure that you get what you want and also to structure the conversation. And here it's wise to start with a couple of pilot interviews on sympathetic people that you know a little bit about, that can help you to revise some questions that might not be relevant or rephrase questions that might be seen, might be conceived in a bad way or not, so forth. So it's good to try to test use a couple of pilot interviews. Another way of structuring interviews that I haven't done so much myself, but I have colleagues and others that do that, are by statements. For example, if you want to examine a specific contested issue, perhaps that is quite heated, rather than asking them about this directly, what can be done is to develop statements that often represents different endpoints of the debate. For example, say that there's a mine that is going to be built in a sensitive area. One statement could be that this mine will pollute all our drinking water for a foreseeable future. And another says that the mine will ensure that employment will be provided to our community. And then while neither of the informants might not agree with the statement, it can provoke a discussion to why or why not they agree or disagree. So this can also be a good way to structure an interview, especially if there's a limited topic that is quite heated. You can also complement interviews with photos, either photos that you have taken yourself or perhaps get access to the informant's photos. And this is helpful when research problems can be visible. And also if you're interested to know about past event and compare them to the present. For example, in this picture on the left, the same beach that I was talking about earlier, I asked to see old pictures of the beach when it was hadn't eroded as much yet. And that also triggers memories of what people used to do on the beach and what it meant to them. So it, if you can, it might be a nice option to other ways of structuring an interview. But the most common, and perhaps if you're in the beginning of your research career or a student, is the interview guide, and it's also the most easiest to access and to develop. So it might be the best option. And once you come back from the interviews, for example, with a lot of text and data, how do you then analyze them? And this also relates to different approaches in science. You either, and that also relates to how you design the project, do you start out with already existing theory or hypothesis? This is a deductive approach. Then the questions that you ask in the interview guide, for example, will also be shaped by that. And this is of more common use when the research problem is known. So, for example, you already know a lot about this, you've formulated a hypothesis to why this problem exists and how it should be solved. And then you might use this approach. Another more bottom-up approach is to start from the empirical data and develop the hypothesis based on the patterns you find there. It's an inductive approach. And this is often used when little is known about phenomena. And when you're exploring a new topic. But this doesn't mean that you don't have any idea of what you want to research when you start out. It just means that you're more open to find for findings that emerge through the analysis. But in reality, at least I find it's often data analysis is often a very iterative process. You go back from what you stated as your research objective, what you have in your data, what you find in the empirical data, and what kind of theoretical framework you use. You compare with the relevant literature and continuously adjust. So at least this is the process that I'm most familiar with, and I know that many other qualitative researchers are also more doing this. So you might start out with an idea, you might revise some of the objectives once you've analyzed some of the empirical material. Again, say that you come across a theory that might also help you to make sense of the empirical material and develop codes and so forth. So then moves into categorization and coding of empirical material. This approach and most approaches within qualitative data analysis requires that you have somewhat recorded the data. Either if you're doing interviews, for example, they could either be recorded through your phone or taken up like that. But if sometimes the informant might not be willing to do that, make sure to make detailed notes during the interview and to summarize them immediately after, because I've sometimes done the mistake to wait just a few, maybe just an afternoon or whatever, and then it's quite striking how little details you remember just after a short time. To make sure that to take notes as soon as possible after the interview. And if you, for example, doing participant observation, this to make sure that you write down field notes every day, maybe twice a day, and to make them as detailed as possible. This can also be used for coding and categorization. And then when you have all the empirical data ready, you have a lot of many pages of interviews, perhaps a lot of text. What you can do then is to briefly read the material, not in great detail, and then take note of specific concepts, activities, meanings, and themes that sticks out to you, and also keep in mind your research objectives. This might be first the basics for developing broad codes. And they can be based on your objectives. They can be based on the interview guide, or more broadly on, for example, activities, certain perceptions and forth. There's nothing like wrong or right in doing this, but you just have to be aware of why you select the codes that you do and how you refine them along the way. And then once you have broad codes, you may start to apply these to the material, and often, which is the case, that once you start reading the material more carefully, some of new codes come up and others might disappear. They might not be seen as appropriate. And then at least I find it as a process of refining and recoding according to insights from the material, also comparing this with other literature and so forth. So this coding process is cyclical, as stated in this picture. It's going back and forth from the idea to the data and so forth. So, but I think it's important to keep track of how you develop and how you refine the codes, because often, while there's no right and wrong in such in qualitative data analysis, that you cannot develop the wrong codes if you know the material, if you understand me correctly. But if you, for example, are to submit this as a part of a thesis or a part of publish an article, report, so forth, what is often required is a description of how you did the coding, how the process went from broad codes to refine the codes, and what kind of other central concepts that might have inspired the codes that you selected, and eventually developed into themes, which often are equal to your findings and results. And NVivo, which I will briefly go into now, is a helpful tool in doing this, because before I used NVivo, this coding, often you do it through Excel, you do it through copy and paste things into Word or so forth, but it's difficult to keep track of all the material, and you cannot necessarily access it all at once and so forth. So NVivo is a program that I found helpful in both organizing a project and coding data. So I'm not sure if you are familiar with this program, but there is a possibility to try it for free, I think, for a month. So if you're interested, you could download the trial version and see if it's appropriate to your needs. And it is, I think, for most of you that have qualitative data, and especially if you have quite a lot of it. It's also, I'm mostly familiar with the basic functions of NVivo, but it's steadily growing, and you can do more and more advanced things. For example, you can develop visualizations of the material that you analyze. This is from the interviews that Ratna and her team have carried out on different sectors of the industry and the government in plastic waste, in relation to plastic waste and plastic waste policy. So this from the transcripts of these interviews, you find the most commonly used words. And here I have taken out words like yes, no, and those very common everyday words. So you see that plastic waste, and then plastics are the most common used word, followed by government and so forth. So it can be a nice tool also to do some visualizations of text that might not be so easy in other ways. Yes, I've also included in this presentation, because now we'll actually go into NVivo, some training videos and further readings if you're interested in qualitative data collection and analysis. And when it comes to NVivo, I'll just like to inform you that I'm not a trainer in NVivo, but there are many people that are. So if you're interested in some of the features that I will show you, just Google and put it into YouTube. For example, if you want to know more about coding, literature review, visualizations, write NVivo and that word into YouTube, and you will find much more detailed instructions on how you can do this. Okay. So this is NVivo. Can you see this right now?
No.
No.
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe you have to share first the PPT and then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we see. You can.
Yeah.
See.
Okay. So this is basically NVivo. What it does is that you can import files and classify them and organize them. So for example, with the interviews that Aratna's team have conducted, you import them here. It's easy, it's quite straightforward, even I can do it. So you just select files that you want to import here. And what is also good is that you can give, you can classify them as a case and provide them with some of the demographic information that we might be interested in later when we look at the results. For example, here I didn't have access to age so easily, but at least the gender and if what kind of sector they're predominantly working in. So it's a nice way of organizing interviews, and also to give them some more substance than if you're just having them in Word, for example, or an Excel sheet. You can also import files, literature. You can also do, here, for example, I've imported some academic literature on waste management, policies and strategies, tourism and hospitality. And I will show you later how you can code this. But this is also, you can also give these file classifications. You can maybe Google how to do this better, but you can also organize the literature that you have in NVivo by assigning author, depending upon what's relevant for you, maybe year, title. Perhaps if you're doing a literature review of, like we're doing in plastic waste, different strategies for handling plastic waste by industry, we might also want to know where is this article? Is it covering Indonesia? Is it covering ASEAN? Is it covering Asia? Or is it some country in Europe? That's a variable that you may want to add. What's also good is that you can, as an extension, I don't know if you can see it, I will change. Can you see this now? This web page?
Yes.
Yes. So what in Chrome, when you have NVivo installed, if you're browsing through, for example, some web pages that has relevant information, and you see, oh, this is something that we'd like to capture, this is an extension called NCapture that can capture this information. So it all becomes collected in one place. So for example, this is on single-use plastic ban in Indonesia. You can just add this. Capture, and then it will become imported into NVivo. So what I see as the main benefit of NVivo, except it's coding, and it's also the possibility to use it as an organizing tool for capturing both literature that you have, media, or alternative sources to the problem you want to study. If you come across it, you can import it directly into NVivo. And you can also, so it becomes, instead of having maybe several different files when you have maybe copy and pasted out specific details from a web page and so forth, you can just keep everything in one place, and it makes it much easier to organize a project. And it might be a little bit more time consuming when you first start, but then, especially if it's a larger project, it will become so much easier because everything's in one place, and it makes it easier to access them. So, and the other thing that NVivo is very useful about is this coding that I talked about. So, and you can code both. Interviews. You can also code when you do a literature review. You can code subsections in the literature, and then they all end up under the same heading. I will just show you briefly how For example, this is an interview conducted by Ratna and her team that I've imported into NVivo. No, this is not. Sorry, I will just first show you my coding structure. So this, based upon, like I told you, I had the first basic read through of the documents, and then I came up with quite a lot of codes, and I think later some of them might show to be useful, other might not be so useful. But this is just a brief overview of the codes that are found, and then you can the benefits of NVivo is, for example, when you click into a code that you've developed. I will show you how you develop a code. It's not complicated at all. Instead of having, say, a Word document where this is cut into place, you open this node. You get all the different places where you have I am manually coded. So you get it all collected into one place. Here's one interview saying this about bans on plastic bags or related to this. So you have it all covered in one place, which makes it a lot easier. You can also, for example, if you click on the specific interview, sometimes if you're looking for context, if something seems weird, why did they say that? You can also look at the broader context in which this was said. So you can move back and forth from the actual section that you coded as something and look back to the interview to see where you derived it from. So that's a major benefit as I see it. And what normally happens is when you go through material, you develop code as you go along, and eventually you'll have to start the process of reducing the codes or integrating them into more refined options. And for me, this is material coming from Indonesia. We will also have to have a discussion with the CSEAS and Ratna. What does this mean? As I mentioned before, qualitative data is context dependent. I'm not as familiar with the context in Indonesia, so we will have to discuss what this means. When an actor says this, have I interpreted it correctly? The Ratna have different interpretations and so forth. But so what we can do is, once you've done a very broad, I usually do this, code things very broadly to organize the material. So for example, this is a node that is called segregation. So then you can look through the code segregation. This means, yeah, in practice, it's not running because it's, yeah. So this may relate to, we're just doing this as an exercise. If you want to code, then you right click, code, and say that we want to have it as a subsection of segregation. And you put a new node, and maybe you want to call this, mixed by garbage collector. This was not very, it's not a very refined exercise, but just to show you how easy it is. And then maybe there's something else. Yeah, the majority has not done good effort. So still, yes, some people know it, but what I separate what. So the key is, so maybe this is also, we can call this something. Maybe that's also the sentiment that the the garbage collector is not doing their sorting properly. So there's a possibility to refine the code as we go along. Maybe in terms of finance or education, for example. Here, for example, maybe we want to call this lack of lack of sorting options, bins maybe. These are not very developed codes, but just to show you how easy it is to organize the data in this way. Here, communication, maybe, or I mean education. The community is educated. We could put this as the role of education, maybe. So there are training videos that show you how to do this in detail, but what it allows you to do is to organize the empirical material, and also if we want to go into literature, if for example, you can code in a similar way when you're reviewing literature. So when it comes to writing the literature review, it will be much easier if you have, for example, instead of copying out into an Excel sheet, you could just select maybe background facts. Maybe you're interested in knowing in marking some of the waste estimate. Then you can highlight if rivers, for example, you can highlight the role of rivers. And here you might want to start a new node that is separate from the empirical data. So you could have, for example, literature review. And then again, under this, say the role of rivers. So this is an excellent way of organizing your project as a whole, I think, and also it really helps with the analysis of the data, because you have everything gathered in one place, and also because you can move back and forth from the codes and continuously refine them in a much more transparent and easy way than if you were using other materials. And I think it's also good for example, this ASEAN project that we're working on now. It is focused on reducing plastic pollution, and it has specific focus, but it also generates a lot of data that is useful to classify and to organize, even though that it might not be used immediately. But if we, for example, in a year or whenever we feel like it's needed, want to, what was the waste workers' perception of certain policy, then we can go back and look into it, and it will be much easier to find than if we hadn't organized the material to start off with, or if we just organize it according to very specific research objectives. And NVivo also offers a possibility for automated coding. You can run a query and, for example, develop, it can automatically generate codes for you. I haven't used this so much because maybe that's because I'm more of because I need to look for what the interviews mean in themselves. But there's also possibilities to automate coding and to so it generates codes automatically based upon the words, the frequencies of the words that is used within in the material that you have. So for example, you can look for here. you can see that here is the word count. This was the word cloud I was using earlier. You see how much how many words are used, and you could, according to this, also create codes automatically. But depends upon your interest, and it depends upon what kind of material you have, if it's easy to extract basic codes, or if you need more analysis and reflection before you can determine them. But there's a lot of opportunities in using NVivo for these purposes. And as I say, I'm not, but maybe that's also an argument for why it's good, because I'm not an expert in this program, but I still find it very useful and easy to, pretty straightforward to use. And there's a lot more functions that can be activated or can be used, but just for these basic reasons, I still find it useful. So if you're interested, I'm sure you can learn much more and to make even better use of it. But just for these very basic properties, coding, organizing a project, organizing a literature review, and to keep everything within the same place, I think it's useful. Yes, and I think I would recommend you to look at the training videos that's already on YouTube, that's done solely with the purpose of educating people on how to use NVivo. And if you have interviews that already been transcribed or other material texts ready, you can download a trial and try to make sense of this yourself. There's also possibilities, I haven't used it myself, to, for example, code different sections of audio file. So there is more in this than I'm currently using, but this is just a kind of taster and a start to see if it's something for you and if you think it might be useful. So I think I will just encourage you to keep on looking out for this, and I think I will stop there, and then perhaps we can go to the question and answer section. And since it's soon Christmas, I chose to include a picture of reindeers from Norway.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Marian. Okay, thank you. Very interesting presentation. So now we can, thank you for sharing about the different positions in the philosophy of science, and then qualitative data and collection methods, and also the context and meaning, and categorization and coding, and also how to use NVivo software. So I already collect some questions raised in the YouTube. So the first question about qualitative research is subjective by its nature and bound by the context. When will the insights obtained by qualitative research can then be expanded to the population while the subjectivity is still there? Maybe for the first question.
Yes, I think the subjectivity will always be there, and you might there's been some you can do a very in-depth study of maybe a limited amount of people, but some of the processes that you find there will maybe be generalizable to the whole population, or at least some traits. It's not something that everyone will do, but you might find tendencies that you think also exist in other contexts and in the population in general. But they cannot be expanded as such to be applied upon the population. You have to keep in mind that you may discuss that these tendencies may be a wider phenomenon in the population, but what you find in that specific context cannot be generalizable in that sense. So the subjectivity will always be there, I think, unless you do like the research that you're engaged in that's more qualitative, that is generalizable. and also more objective. But when you look for these more in-depth studies, the subjectivity, I think, is a precondition, as I said. Yes.
Yeah. And the second question coming from Daniel, he said that is the number of participants and how many times the researcher being repeated the only factors to differentiate it with quantification research so that it can be achieved generalization related to, yeah.
Yes, I think that's an interesting point, but depends on what you want to get out of the study. Because if you want to find something more, if you want to find out a meaning about something or the phenomena in a specific context, then generalization is not really the aim. It's not the aim. It's to find something specific, not general. So, and then the question, I think here, it mainly refers to quantitative research. And I think that's it's an interesting question, but it's also something that I find, and probably you too, sometimes when you do qualitative research, you often assume that there is that it should be able to be generalizable and also replicated. And this is often that's not the intention of these types of studies. It's important to make the distinction. But saying that, as I mentioned before, there are certain, like if you know a phenomena in a very, say that you study a local community and a specific process there in very much detail, you may gain, may be able to develop, for example, a theory that can be applied and be generalizable to other contexts, but it doesn't mean that the exact results from that study applies everywhere. It's more about the concepts that you develop from that study that might be transferable and applied in other contexts.
Yeah, because maybe like you said, qualitative and quantitative research is a bit different.
Yeah.
Qualitative, more in-depth and more deep and by context, right? So move to the question related to NVivo software. So there is a question, does NVivo can do text mining analysis such as sentiment analysis?
It can certainly do text mining, so the Gophros, and I'm not quite sure what exactly sentiment analysis is in this context, but I'm sure that there are lots of alternative instructions that can provide you with a better answer to this. I know that it does. It's excellent at doing text mining, so I'm sure that it can do.
And someone said that currently carrying out some qualitative data analysis using NVivo, and she was wondering how she could create a network model or diagram to show the relationship between coding. What's the difference of mind maps and concept maps?
Yeah, I think you can, once you have doing the concept maps, I admit that I'm not a very advanced user of NVivo, but what you can do once you have developed the code is to connect them, and that I think is the concept map. The mind maps I have not used yet, but I think to get a better answer on this, I think the best way is to look at the proper training channels.
Yeah. So move to the next question. How to conduct a content analysis of integrated reports using NVivo? Maybe also integrate some, maybe if like our research, we have some research questions, how to manage it in one working NVivo.
Between us or between to organize the material after some research questions? Yes. We can you can do a query, run a query based upon the objectives and the keywords that we have developed there, and then it will, like I said, you can get an automated code so that everything that relates to that is found. But you can also do, as we might want to share the NVivo between us and work simultaneously, and then we can also discuss how to develop common codes, and that I think is how the content is analyzed to sort the material into different sections and so forth. So content analysis, I think, is possible to do in NVivo quite easily. Yeah.
Okay, and the next question, what tools are available in NVivo software for systematic literature review? Dr. Carson.
I will have to guide you to there are these tools that you can classify the files. You can also, as you normally do with a systematic literature review, I think you have to use the databases to access the articles and to sort that. That is, as I understand it, outside NVivo, but you can use the NVivo to like more instead of going through the articles as you normally do, reading them, maybe using an Excel sheet, you can easily classify certain attributes in the article in NVivo, and you have it collected in one place. You can also code if you're looking for, say, collective action in the local level in different then it will be possible. So, but again, I provided a link in the YouTube that goes into much greater depth into explaining the NVivo. Yeah.
Okay, we have two more questions from YouTube. First, how to connect two different variables into a table in NVivo?
Two different
Two different variables.
like
Yeah, two different variables, maybe like weights and maybe another variables to into a table in NVivo.
but what you can do is it's nice to merge. Like first you can connect all the codes that belongs to one like waste picker, waste segregation. You can congregate them into one node, and then you can, like the previous question, there's also a tool to kind of show the connections, the relationships between different nodes. And it can also show in what sentence they are being referred to and what relationship the different variables have to each other.
Mm. And the last question I got from the YouTube, can NVivo facilitate to use category systems and rating scale to systematically analyze classroom instruction and automatic coding for video data?
Figure data.
Yes, video data.
I'm not sure about the figure data. It can do maybe. I'm sure, but you have to look at that specific video, I think. Yes.
Okay. Okay, that's all the question from the YouTube. Now we come to the end of the session. So maybe Dr. Carson, do you have more comments and more?
No, I think I would encourage you to explore NVivo, and as I said, there's so much training material out there. So any of the questions here, if you just type in NVivo and mind map, concept map, I'm sure that there are people that have thought about this for a long time and that have a very good ability to answer those questions in short YouTube videos. So if you're interested, there's a lot of training material. But thank you so much for participating, and I'm very glad to have shared this afternoon or morning with you.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Carson. So, yes, we come to the end of the online training on qualitative data analysis, example from NVivo software. So when conducting qualitative research, so many types of data we got from our collection data, so such as documents, images, audios, and other data files, which is very essential and very useful. But it can be extremely time consuming. So using technology such as NVivo software that Dr. Carson said before can make our work easier to access our data, and NVivo can be as organizing tools to coding our data as well. So maybe we may not finalize all the issues with only one day course for today. So we hope we can do it again and help further training course for more advanced training. So thank you very much. On behalf of the organizer, I would like to extend our deepest appreciation to you all who participate. And we wish you always in the good health. And we are looking forward to meeting you in our future events. So once again, thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.